Okay, so today I'd like to welcome to the show Matthew Carpenter. What's your full title? Do you have a full title?
Just Matthew Carpenter, yeah. I'm a PhD researcher, so I'm holding on until you get that doctor title.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I won't call you doctor just yet, but yeah, thank you for coming on. I appreciate you spending some time talking to us today on understanding ultra. So I'm hoping that this does have relevance to the kind of podcasts I've been doing, because as myself as a keto low carb ultra runner, I've obviously got an interest in the kind of research that you do. But for the listener, for the viewer, who may not know who you are, could you just sort of summarize who you are and what your job is, basically?
Yeah, cool. So firstly, yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to this chat. Whenever diet and nutrition comes up, it's a chat that can last for hours and hours, so they're always good fun. But yeah, my background is, so I'm studying optimizing sort of fueling for keto adapted athletes as part of my PhD, and so that kind of started horrendously long ago now. Actually, it started whilst I was an undergraduate and then a master's student at Kingston University in southwest London, and we did some case study research looking at keto diets. So we kind of came across keto diets, or at least I came across keto diets particularly in the remit of ultra endurance, because the two kind of go hand in hand, especially where you get those sort of growing hype, and there still is really, but there's growing hype around keto diets, and you look into, right, where's this hype in terms of endurance exercise, and it's particularly in these sort of ultra remit. So luckily, living where we do, I think, so I live in southwest London, we've got a lot of incredible running routes, and it seems to just breed like endurance like athletes, or like the weekend warriors kind of. We've got Richmond Park on our doorstep, we've got the Thames, etc. So sort of walk outside, is everyone's running, everyone's cycling. It's the amount of expensive bikes I watch go past my house is insane. So anyway, we kind of wanted to look at, originally I wanted to do a full, get 10-15 people in for a study on keto diets, and then had a chat with my supervisor, and we thought, good luck. so we decided to do a case study on an ultra endurance marathon runner, just to see what would happen basically to his metabolism and his performance when he went keto. And so we did sort of two different studies with him. I'll just jump into them briefly, but we basically made him go keto, played around with what he ate around his run system, sort of 60 to 67 kilometer runs, and just looked at what was happening to his metabolism, how he felt, etc., what was making him go faster. And so that was kind of where I got into keto, is kind of doing that research, and really spurred myself and my supervisory team to be like, okay, we want to pursue this further with a PhD where we can actually get bigger numbers of people in and really dive into it as much as we can. And so that's where I come from in terms of, that's what I do. And so right now we've got kind of a range of bits going on, but they all kind of culminate in optimizing fueling for keto adapted athletes, and also using kind of keto adapted individuals as a way of better understanding metabolism in general. Because I think you can learn huge amounts from, because I think people might forget when they've been sort of, when their diet feels so normal to you, but it's such an abnormal way of eating, right, in terms of just the general population, and it's such an abnormal metabolic state compared to the rest of the population, that it's actually fascinating to look at in a lab. So often, if I've got keto diets people in my lab, I'll be looking at their data on our screens, and their fat metabolism in particular, but all sorts of things, where I look at that and I just almost like show it off to the other students we've got who are looking at completely just standard non-keto individuals. I'm like, you can't do that. So I think really what I'm doing is twofold. It's firstly looking at how do we optimize performance for keto adapted athletes, and also just kind of looking further into the potential merits of keto adaptation and fat adaptation, etc. And also using that to kind of better understand physiology. And so with that, we're kind of looking at supplementation. So we have things like looking at carbohydrate supplementation around fat adaptation, and ketone ester supplementation around fat adaptation as well. And also we kind of want to better understand keto adapted athletes, or just people on long-term carbohydrate restricted diets, for me to better inform future research about how we're actually going to do an intervention. Because I think it's easy to misunderstand, I think, what a ketogenic diet is, particularly when it comes to endurance, and especially ultra endurance athletes, because we have a lot of research on weight loss and keto diets and all these things. I think a lot of this research can get kind of pushed together in terms of this is what keto is, when I think it's probably, it's very different for an ultra endurance athlete compared to what it is for someone who's, you know, who's doing it to lose weight. So it's just, yeah, getting a better understanding of keto adapted athletes and how to optimize their performance is kind of how I would describe what I'm doing.
And that's Kingston University in London. Yeah,
it is, yeah.
What kind of testing equipment have you got there for this sort of work?
So the main stuff I'm looking at, we have it's called a Vintus, basically a way of measuring. It's a metabolic cart essentially. So we look at oxygen consumption. With that, we look at exercise economy and metabolism in particular, so fat and carbohydrate metabolism. Alongside that, we'll often do finger prick blood sampling, so we'll get lactate measures, glucose measures, and blood keto measures. We take that as well. Obviously, that's just as you could take in your own home. We do in the lab, we have ways to do sort of venous blood samples. That's something I've stayed away from right now just because people don't like it. I have enough trouble getting participants in finding keto adapted athletes. When you tell them you're going to stick a needle into their veins, it's just sort of one step away. So we've got actually our labs. I love our lab. It's amazing. We've got a lot of, we had a flood a couple of years ago, which was, we had to have a chemistry lab above us that over Christmas had a bit of a field day and leaked into our lab. So we got quite a lot of, we had a lot of ruined equipment then. Luckily we sort of replaced it all now, but yeah, we've got a treadmill like you've never seen before. Every time I go into the lab, I just sort of double take it. It goes both ways. It's ginormous. We actually had I forget what the world record was. We had someone do a world record on that treadmill. I forget. I think it was like distance covered on a treadmill in 12 hours or something. But yeah, we got things like that, and just a bunch of sort of old school sports science equipment as for teaching. So everything's like, it's called mononic bikes, and the kind of the old school bikes, you'll put like weights on them, rather than like, because a lot of the equipment we have now is electronic, so you kind of don't see what's happening. So we still have a lot of that kind of older stuff. So you may have seen things like Douglas bags, which are like the first iteration of metabolic testing, where someone would breathe basically into a bag, and you've measured this bag to look at carbohydrate, fat oxidation, metabolism, etc. So now we're far beyond that in sports science in terms of you've got fancy equipment that kind of does it for you and is a lot easier.
Real time.
Yeah, exactly. And it takes a lot of human error out, which is always nice. But we still have all those kind of older pieces of equipment in there, which are quite nice. It's kind of like the classic sports science, like the old school stuff that kind of gives you a real way to visualize what's happening. Because it's easy for us, we'll get people to just breathe into a tube. It goes into, like, for all we know, it just goes into some stuff and we never see it again. You kind of don't know what's going on. But then you look at this, when you're teaching, you look at this big bag that someone's breathing into, and it's like, you know exactly what's happening here. Like, you're breathing into a bag and we're just measuring the contents of the bag. Yeah, it's good. Like, we've got a few. That's our physiology lab. We have some people around the corner. We've got a biomechanics lab, which I stay well away from, where we measure sort of velocities and force and bits like that, which is also interesting. But yeah, I stay a long way away from that.
Yeah, wow. So it sounds like, is there anything that you wish that you had, like if it was kind of like, if there was an open checkbook and you could have any bit of equipment for testing athletes, what would it be?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a really good question. Ooh.
I've heard like these, you know, the people have been talking about there's a couple of treadmills in the world that they go up to like a ridiculous like incline, and they're like handmade by only like one person in America or something like that.
I think I'd have a heart attack trying to test one of those. The amount of health and safety that would have to go through. Do you know what? It's difficult. So the one thing, so my background's in rowing in terms of my sport. I was rowing throughout my time at university, and I mean, it's not even a big expense, but a couple of good rowing machines wouldn't go amiss, because I think you get some really interesting. I think rowers are a really interesting subset of the population because they're very big, but also they've got huge aerobic bases. But to be honest, in our lab, it's got kind of everything we need. What are better options for, so muscle biopsies are something we don't do in our lab, which I say I'd like to do. Realistically, I wouldn't do them now anyway. But I think there's some really interesting data from muscle biopsy data, especially within sports science, just because we can look at things like muscle glycogen usage and bits like that, which would be really nice to do. But I wouldn't be doing them anyway. But that'll probably be what I would like in there. If I had an unlimited budget, I'll be taking venous samples, muscle biopsies, the absolute lot.
Well, it sounds like you've got enough stuff to keep you busy anyway.
For now, yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask you then, as far as your like career path, why choose the subject of like ketogenic diets? Because there's you know, it doesn't really have a great rep out there, does it? So you almost like putting yourself on the back foot straight away with your choice of the thing that you want to study. How did you kind of get yourself down this road?
To be honest, when I did it, so I never really planned on doing a PhD. My reason for doing it was because of the subject that I wanted to do it on more than anything. So I did my master's and I was looking at this on the side as part of my project when we were doing our keto case studies. And I just got talking to my supervisor about this as a PhD, as something we could do together. And so really it was more the subject and the topic drove me to do this rather than me wanting to do a PhD and choosing it. If I just wanted to do a PhD for the sake of a PhD, I'll be staying well away. I'll be staying a long way away from keto diets, I think. But really, it's a topic that interests me, and that's why I chose to do it. Saying that, I do think you're right. It's not the simplest topic to do, in terms of it's quite a, I suppose, controversial might not be the best word, but it definitely divides opinion. But I think actually I see that as quite a nice challenge, because I'm hoping to kind of change that and just allow the kind of an acceptance, or just like because I think this is happening just in general, where I think in my area in sports science, at least, you're getting more research coming out that's kind of what I'd call actually like good data coming out to kind of balance out and just give the impression that it's kind of like a respectable area, that, you know, and kind of more acceptance just for the area as a whole. I think, might be famous last word, but I feel like the debate is slowly becoming slightly less polarized, and kind of I'm hoping to be a part of that. Again, I might well eat my words, but that's I think what I'm sensing, but we'll see about that, I suppose. And it kind of comes down to how you talk about it. And when I say you, I mean myself. The aim of my writing isn't to be controversial or anything like that. It's to kind of report my data and discuss my data. I don't plan on making any crazy claims, and I'm not going to be recommending the world go keto anytime soon. And so I'm hoping that's reflected really in, hopefully a lot of research comes out, and some research by nature is controversial depending on the findings, and depending on what I find, maybe there'll be a big Twitter storm. It's hard to avoid them these days, but I'm hoping by the way it's written, something can be, you know, interesting and can be even slightly against the grain, but still be kind of accepted into a greater body of literature. So that's kind of what I'm going for.
I think having sort of done my own research over the years into studies and what people have already done before I dabbled with it always seemed like it was a bit of a sort of not widely accepted as an approach, and it almost feels like a bit of an underground, still feels to me like a bit of an underground thing, because like you say, it is one of the most divisive subjects, especially when you speak to athletes about, and endurance athletes, about what kind of approach they take. It seems like, do you think it's just the sort of the world we live in now, where everything's polarized, and that's why people have got such strong opinions about it, or are quick to sort of dismiss it? Do you think there will be a time in the future where it will be sort of mainstream and accepted that this is another approach to take, and it's just becomes normal for people it doesn't turn into a Twitter battle when people sort of lay this information out there?
Yeah, I think in a lot of circles it already is. I think everything on Twitter becomes a battle. There's a problem with Twitter. I think in a lot of circles it's accepted. I think the issue, I guess, with nutrition specifically is that it's very easy for everyone to have an opinion on, because everyone kind of has to do it. Everyone has to eat, and so everyone has like something to kind of ground their opinion on, which is why, especially if I think of sports science, I think of friends I've got looking at, my biomechanics lab, the people that work in that, when they talk to people about what they're doing, it could be a really controversial topic within biomechanics, but but they're not going to have any pushback from their great aunt that they see once every 3 years, who's got her own experiences of it. So I think it comes it comes to a point where, because everyone's seen something about nutrition, everyone follows their own kind of nutritional pattern. So I think that kind of comes down to, in a sense, why it can be kind of controversial. And I hope it's going to become, at least in the research, I think it's going to become, I think it's already becoming just more mainstream, more accepted. And I guess in terms of like a general public type thing, at least in the athletic world, I feel like the perception tends to follow the research a few years behind, maybe. So I guess it depends. I hope it does. I think there's always going to be an element of controversy, but I think the more people that do it, because more people are doing it, especially when it comes to ultra endurance, it's becoming far more popular, and people are seeing the likes of like Zach Bitter's doing very well, Dan Plews, people like that, kind of what I would call, I guess, respectable faces of it. So I do have a problem with the fact that when you look at sort of nutrition gurus on either side, it becomes like a big old fight from these people up here that are kind of, that I feel like the extremes kind of, everything kind of ends up in the middle. And I see people like that are kind of just putting a more sort of a less dogmatic face on it. And I feel like that's kind of what the future is going to be. But I think there's always going to be the kind of fighting from the sort of popular diet advocates, because that's just what they do.
Yeah, and I know, yeah, exactly what you mean when you speak about like faces and on both sides. And Zach Bitter is a great example, because I've interviewed Zach before, and you've been on his podcast as well. And I think he kind of, to me, he represents like the very, not, I wouldn't say straight-laced, but he represents, he's very measured with how he describes his approach. So it was sort of him that helped me understand that it doesn't have to be like dogmatic. It doesn't have to be that you've got to be, almost religious about it. There is nuance in there, and you've got to find that nuance for yourself. But it may take time, but guys like him are sort of blazing a trail for this movement, and it can be something that's not dogmatic, and it does work for just your average athlete, but also clearly works for somebody, as talented and elite as Zach. As far as like the testing that you're doing at the moment and the studies you're doing at the moment, is there anything that you can talk about that you're doing right now that you sort of excites you in this medium?
It all excites me. So I guess without having any results, I can tell you exactly what we're doing. And I think right now our biggest study is we've got a lab-based study looking at, it's cycling specific, but really the reason for that is cycling is easier in the lab to do than running. We want trained athletes, and as long as they're competent on a bike, as long as they're endurance based, we get them in. And we're looking at it's fairly high intensity endurance performance, because studying ultra endurance in a lab is hard, right? We want to do it, it's difficult, and we wanted to look at, are carbohydrates going to help the performance of keto adapted individuals, but also how much does carbohydrate influence the metabolism of keto adapted individuals, which I think is really interesting, because and you can look at any kind of sporting event in terms of endurance, where fat adaptation or fat burning is important. So ultra endurance, good example. And it's very important to know, right, how much carbohydrate do you need whilst you're going? And a big question I have for keto adapted people is, well, how much is taking that carbohydrate going to actually impair fat oxidation? Because I know I've spoken to some people that are kind of almost scared to take carbohydrate because they're like, I want to make sure I'm burning fat. And so what I suspect what we're kind of starting to see, but also just our theory, our hypothesis before, is that once you're fat adapted, you can take carbohydrate and still burn a lot of fat, which is really important. It's really valuable to know. I guess the question then is, how much fat do you still burn? Because you want to know, right, well, really, it's a question of how much carbohydrate does someone need. There's also a question of just how much carbohydrate is going to make someone faster when they're keto adapted. And so this is kind of what I'm excited about, particularly because we're looking at the exact kind of distance that would be the sort of distance that you wouldn't recommend someone go keto for, really. It's like a high intensity aerobic performance. So what we're doing is it's a 16.1 kilometer time trial on the bike. So it tends to be about, you know, half an hour or so, 25 to 35 minutes. And so it's quite hard. It's quite glycolytic. And so no matter how keto adapted you are, you're burning quite a lot of carbohydrate, but you're not going to be glycogen depleting because it's only 25 to 35 minutes. So I'm interested in how much is carbohydrate going to help, and also then just how much is going to change someone's metabolism. So there's a lot going on there, because we're looking at steady state work as well. So just simple sort of, you know, easy, when I think of runners, I think of that sort of pace that you can hold a conversation at, sort of just the forever pace. So they'll do an hour at that kind of pace, and then they'll do a time trial. And so I'm very interested in just the impact of carbohydrate on that. Firstly, on just their metabolism. How much is it actually impacting their metabolism? Is it going to impact it at all? My theory would be you'd increase your carbohydrate burning slightly, but not that much. And then ultimately, is it going to impact their performance? So then someone doing a park run on a Saturday morning on keto, do they need to, you know, if they really want to go fast 1 week, are they going to be helped by having a banana in the morning or a couple of days of carbohydrates? Or does it actually not matter because it's a 5 kilometer run, they're not going to be depleting their glycogen, etc. How much benefit is there actually to adding some carbohydrate on top? Because there was a 5K paper not recent, everything feels recent now because of COVID, a couple of years ago, I think it came out, from South Africa. I think Philip Prins was the main author, and they looked at 5 kilometer performance following fat adaptation. And actually once the group fat adapted, they were no worse than the control group. There was no impairment in performance, which surprised me because I would expect, you know, very glycolytic event. I think they were quite good 5K athletes running 20, 21 minutes, I think. And yeah, they got no slower after either 4 or 6 weeks of fat adaptation. And so I saw that and I thought, well, firstly, I had 2 questions actually, because you have a keto group and a non-keto group, and the keto group wasn't impaired at all. So the 2 things I'm thinking are, okay, so do the keto group, do you need carbs for a 5K outside of the elite level? You know, do you actually need carbs at all even for these high intensity performances, really, unless you're earlier to Kipchoge. But then secondly, I look at that from a research perspective and I think, what about if we gave that keto group carbohydrate before? It's actually going to make them faster, and then is it going to be like a benefit? Which again is an open question. So I think I'm excited about this particular research in terms of the carbohydrate provision, because it opens a lot of potential doors. And also what I like about it in particular, to be honest, is that I couldn't care less what the research shows. Like, it's the ultimate, because everyone, and we all have biases in research. And as a researcher, you accept the biases, and many people will say have a bias towards ketogenic diets, etc., which they may be right in saying. But for me, I mean, I show either carbohydrate improves performance in keto adapted people, which I think would be fascinating, or carbohydrate doesn't make keto adapted people any faster, which I think is just as interesting in a completely different way. So actually, I'm in a really nice position where, because naturally a lot of researchers kind of hope for positive results because it makes their research more publishable, it's going to be more notable, etc. For me, if there's no effect, it's just as interesting as if there is an effect, which is really exciting for me because it takes out any stress of, I hope I see something, because otherwise my research might not get published. I've got no stake in the game, which is just quite a nice position to be in for that paper. I guess just the other thing I'm quite excited about is, so over COVID we started like a remote study looking at keto esters, and we're doing some work in the lab with them as well, but on non-keto adapted athletes, because I think in future I think we're going to see a lot more work on ketones as a supplement. Firstly, because I think it can teach us a lot about metabolism, and that's kind of what I'm hoping to do with this remote study, where we're getting people to cycle. It's about a 50 to 55 minute race, this one, and just seeing how keto esters and carbohydrate kind of interact on performance for keto adapted people, which is really interesting. In particular, because I think you get a lot of hype whenever supplements come out. There's always a lot of hype around them. And one thing I'm interested in, you get a lot of people talk about ketones and whether they can benefit performance, but you don't see very many papers looking at ketones by themselves. They always add carbohydrate in. And so for our research, we wanted to see, right, we want at least one group here where we just have the keto ester and nothing else, because you see people do it and just use keto ester. And I'm not convinced that'll work by itself. And actually in keto adapted people, I see a really good rationale for combining keto ester and carbohydrate. But it's not been done yet. And I think with kind of, because of all my work being on keto adapted people, I look at every paper and every research paper I read through the lens of how can I do this with keto adapted people? Like, would this be interesting? because there's just so much to learn, and I'm lucky to have, you know, come into contact with a lot of people like yourself who are on long-term keto diets, which, like I say, make perfect research participants.
I think that it's a kind of a win-win situation, isn't it? Like you were saying with the research, if you find that, you know, you need carbs or you don't need carbs, then as a keto adapted athlete, it's a win-win, because it's just more information, isn't it, for us to work with. And I'd love to know personally, you know, that whether, you know, being on a carb restricted diet and then taking strategic carbs, that you know, that saying that we have strategic carbs, taking them, because I've done my own experiments, like being fasted and then taking a gel 20 minutes before, or taking a gel during, and I, because it's not in a research setting, I don't know from day to day whether my training load was higher or lower. And I seem to find a benefit in taking on a gel during you know, a hard effort, so something that would be classed as like a tempo run, even though I would have sort of for those days before that been very, very low carb, and then hit myself with a shock of, do you think it's something, it's more to do with what's circulating in your bloodstream at that point, or is it a case of you being able to use both fuel sources in sync? Have you any insights on that?
When it comes to carbohydrate use, it's one thing that my research won't show, annoyingly, that I want to look at is how, if carbohydrate is going to benefit, how will it? Because, I mean, there's a question I guess you're alluding to, is kind of like, how much do you actually need the carbohydrate you're taking on board? Because there's a line of argument to say you're in a non-glycogen depleting activity, so like a high intensity effort, you've got enough carbohydrate to put you through it, even on a low carb diet. So what's the need of exogenous carbohydrate? And if I'm to theorize, the main benefit, I think, likely comes through the way carbohydrate works on the brain. So rather than it being anything to do with, you know, you need it to top up your glycogen levels, which maybe some people do if you're running very low on glycogen, for example, if you're doing a hard piece and you know, the day before you did a fairly hard piece as well, or something like this. Because there is research to show that glycogen below sort of 40% max, then you are going to see some impairments. Maybe just getting it up to that level is what you need. But for most people, if your glycogen's at like resting levels and not actively depleted, I suspect much of the benefit, if there is a benefit of carbohydrate, comes from just that like brain stimulation. There is some work on like carbohydrate mouth rinse now, which I'd love to see in keto adapted athletes. But on carbohydrate mouth rinse, to look at just without even swallowing the carbohydrate, it can improve your performance if you come in fasted, which is really interesting, and just it feels wrong. It doesn't pass the eye test, but there's a lot of research on it, and when someone comes in fasted, it improves performance. And so then you think, okay, how much is carbohydrate having this like physiological effect versus basically a psychological effect? Which makes sense, because when speaking to people, and they mention carbohydrate being like their rocket fuel or things like that, and it kind of comes back to that. You know, they feel really good. They take it and they feel like, okay, you know, even actually taking the brain out of it completely as well. If you take something that you think is going to make you faster, often you run faster because what would you call it, placebo effect. And so there's a lot of different mechanisms, which is why we double blind our research, just to make sure we don't have that placebo effect. And as a side note, it's amazing how easy it is to blind someone to carbohydrate. So we have like a 0-calorie squash drink. And I remember when I was creating the drinks, I thought I'm going to have to put in a load of sweeteners, and like, how am I going to master taste? Because I'm going to put, you know, basically put a bunch of, you know, sugar in one, and the other one's going to be 0 sugar. Like, surely they'll taste different. They taste exactly the same. You can add as much like dextrose to a drink as you want. It tastes exactly the same with or without, which I found fascinating, because I was like, what? I mean, also as a long time like Diet Coke drinker, like, I never really drank like the sugary Coke anyway. But I've always thought, like, what was the point of that one in the first place? Because I honestly, and I know there are people who can taste the difference between Coke and Diet Coke, but I thought I was going mad. So I was like there making my PhD friends like taste it, like, right, tell me which one's got sugar in. No one knew. So so it's a really easy study to blind. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of there's a lot of potential mechanisms by which carbohydrate could improve performance, or also theoretically why it might not, especially in a fat adapted athlete who is by nature not as good at using carbohydrate, because you downregulate all the carbohydrate based enzymes that you need to effectively metabolize it.
Yeah.
So that's why there are so many questions, and either way it kind of brings out more questions. So yeah, it's a win-win for me. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, because I know that was always my worry, that once I'd become fat adapted and sort of low carb, I then sort of played with what I would take on, because I'd read research on training the gut and thought, well, can I get the benefit of carbs now that I've been in a fat adapted state? Will me shifting more towards carbs improve my performance and make it better because I'm using this dual fuel more efficiently, or will it just sort of push me back to being, you know, a high carb burner again and lose all the benefits I feel like I've got from being low carb? And for me it was a bit of a wake-up call, because I suddenly was getting stomach issues during long training runs, and stomach issues in races, and was you know, a few bouts of throwing up, and in the end I kind of put it down to the fact that I'd started to increase my carbs, and then subsequently then sort of reduced it again and started to feel loads better, and then went back to sort of the approach that I'd always taken of, you know, run for an hour, take one gel every 45 minutes to an hour, and that seemed to sort of reset my ability to be able to run and not have any stomach issues. Do you think that at some point, well, this may be sort of highly individualized, but do you think we could eventually come up with a set of guidelines for, if you've gone low carb and keto and fat adapted, you will only be able to creep up to this amount of carbs before you then see a detrimental effect? Do you think that's something that could be sort of mainstream for people, or would it be highly, because nutrition is highly individualized anyway, do you think we could find those sort of figures and apply them to Joe Public?
I think you definitely get a ballpark. I think you have kind of a few things in terms of race dependent, and depending on how much carbohydrate you're burning really tells you how much carbohydrate you need. So even taking out like an individual difference, it may be very race dependent. Over longer races, you'll be burning more fat compared to carbohydrate. You'll be doing it for a longer time, so you need more carbohydrate overall, but per hour probably slightly less. Over shorter races, you might be more carbohydrate dependent. So there's those things that come into it as well. I think there are kind of some things we definitely do know. The first one being that fat adapted athletes will need less carbohydrate than non-fat adapted athletes, simply because they use less carbohydrate. It's not too complex in that sense. In terms of absolute amounts, obviously it comes down to what someone can tolerate. And maybe some people can't tolerate even very small amounts. I don't know many people that do, especially compared to, you know, taking on fats or proteins during a run, which I think for many people, at least from my experience, is even harder. I think, and if someone was to say they get stomach issues at, you know, say 20 grams an hour or real minuscule amounts, I think there's an element to which you can probably train that in your training. So I think even when you're low carb fat adapted, you still don't want to be trying anything completely new on race day, right? I mean, that's like the cardinal sin of ultra endurance, or any kind of endurance, is, you know, doing something new on race day. So I think there's an element to which you can still train your gut to an extent to consume enough carbohydrate when you're fat adapted. And I mean, the only way to know very precisely how much carbohydrate you need would be to do kind of like metabolic testing. But as a kind of rule, I tend to find from speaking to fat adapted athletes, often like a sort of 35 to 45 grams-ish is quite common per hour of carbohydrate. Doesn't mean everyone needs it. I think people running at lower intensities may not need that much. Yeah, you're right that it's individualized to an extent, but I would speculate that most people, very few people wouldn't need more than 45 grams an hour. And as long as you've trained, you're used to, you've practiced in nutrition before, I don't think many people will get stomach issues at that kind of, you know, 30 to 40-ish grams an hour. Compared to, you know, the kind of ultra endurance adage and the recommendations that you see of train the gut to consume 60 to 90 grams an hour, which which is difficult. And some people can do it. I've spoken to fat adapted athletes that have just played around and said they can get up to 75 grams an hour when they need to. But then it's a question of need. And when you're fat adapted, you just don't need that much, especially when you're doing an ultra event. You don't need 75 grams of carbs an hour at all if you're burning enough fat. So it's definitely a case of there is an individual element, and there's also like a race element of it, in terms of it'll be different depending on the race. But I think most people that I speak to do include some carbohydrate, especially, I mean, over ultra endurance, it becomes, it's very hard. If you want to go on no carbohydrates at all, I mean, I know people have done it, and there's been some like incredible achievements of people running, insane distances, fasted, etc., or just consuming electrolytes and stuff. It's probably not the fastest way to do it. It's amazing. But just for the want of keeping your glycogen stores just topped up, keep preventing hypoglycemia, because even though with ketones circulating, hypoglycemia is not necessarily dangerous, it's still probably going to impair performance. So just preventing that. And to do that, you don't need huge amounts of carbohydrate. It's kind of just taking in, like you say, probably not similar to what you're doing, just a gel every 45 minutes or something like that it's not a huge amount on the gut. It's not a huge amount of carbohydrate. But it's all you need just to keep those things kind of just at a level that isn't going to detriment you, whilst you can make the most of that increase in fat oxidation.
Yeah, that's good advice. So as far as on that sort of vein then, as far as for somebody who's watching, listening to this now, and he's never been, fat adapted, low carb, keto or anything, how would you advise from your side of things, from the scientific side of things, what kind of approach would you encourage people to try and view it with? Which angle should they go at? Should they go in sort of cold turkey with carbs, or should it be sort of a gradual thing? What's your research? Has it given you any insights on the best approach for it?
It's a really good question, that is. So what I would say is, what I find is people that have been on the diet for a long time tend to be more flexible, and I think there's probably good reason for that, in that they've given themselves that kind of, once you're confidently fat adapted, you kind of have room to be flexible. If someone, I think my recommendation personally would be for someone to go, if they're going to do it, go all in and do it. Because I think, and this is really, unfortunately in research, we don't have, I would love to do this study, by the way, of doing exactly that, right? Because we know ketos or flu or keto induction, however people want to call it, we know it's a thing, and it's very debilitating for some people. For some people, it's kind of, meh, they were kind of okay. I've spoken to other people who say they can barely get out of the house for a few weeks, which is, so there are a couple of things there, and that you have to be ready for that to come if it's going to come, because otherwise, it's going to be very demotivating to think, I'm an ultra endurance runner and now I can't run a 5K. You have to know that that's going to be temporary. But my advice right now to someone would be to go straight into it and just do it, and get the first 2 months done, and be strict for those 2-3 months, just because otherwise I think there's a case, you say it's almost like prolonging the agony if you're doing it slowly. And I would want someone to be confident that they are fully fat adapted, and the best way to do that for me is just to go straight into it. Now you could go the other way, like you say, and remove things slowly and drop your carbs 10% a week or something like that, and you'll see a gradual increase in fat oxidation as you do that, as you drop the carbohydrate down. But the actual full fat adaptation, I think you're just prolonging the agony. And I don't think, because we haven't got the data on it, I'm not convinced necessarily that it's going to improve any symptoms of keto flu necessarily. I would have thought originally that it would have. My kind of guess would be, if you do it more slowly, maybe you'll be able to avoid the kind of keto flu. But actually then I'm doing some interview-based research where I speak to keto adapted individuals and I ask them about their own experiences. And it's kind of one of the things I asked about was, when people first got into keto diets, how did they do it and how did they feel? And actually what I found was that the people that did it slowly, people would mention sort of cutting out sugars and then cutting out starch and things like this. And actually, I didn't notice any difference between that. They spoke about keto flu in just the same light as people that went cold turkey, which I think is interesting, because it kind of flew in the face of what I would have assumed. And because of that, I would say, especially if someone wants to be very confident they're fat adapted, just do it strictly, and then loosen up, rather than kind of starting on the slowly moving into it.
It's almost like you've got to, I know from my experience, of doing it. It's almost like you've got to lock yourself in. And I remember back to when I first attempted it, and it went disastrously wrong, because I just thought, cut all carbs out, and didn't realize I needed to replace it with, with fats and more protein, and just kind of crashed after about 3 days, and thought, I had to be rescued on my normal commuting run by my wife. And I thought, oh, maybe it's not for me. Maybe I do need carbs after all. But then doing more research and realizing that I needed to, ramp up my fat intake to replace, those lost carbs. And, I did a lot better. But it was for months and months and months, I was like super strict with it. Like, sort of, if you even mentioned sugar in the house, it was, a forbidden word. And but I think that's like you say, that's what you need to be able to put yourself into that sort of state, and for your body to then go, okay, this is a permanent thing that we're doing. We'll just adjust to it, and we'll be burning ketones. Well, this is what we're doing from now on. And it's almost like you have to rewrite, your own software in your head, so that your body just goes, oh, this is what we're doing now. But then at first I was, I'd go out for a meal with friends, and I'd be sweating because they're ordering burgers, and I was trying to find something on the menu to order that, at the minimum amount of carbs in it, and I was stressing over having like chicken goujons or something that was breaded, and I was like, no, they're breaded, I can't have the bread. And I look back now and laugh, because I just think it's ridiculous. Now I would just go in and I would choose something low carb, but I wouldn't be stressed out about it like I was. But I think you're right that it's almost like it's something that you need to do to begin with, to be able to put yourself into that sort of category, and for your body to understand that that's what we're doing from now on. And I suppose if you tried to do it gradually, then maybe your body would be like, well, I'm not going to fully commit to it, because we're still getting carbs. So why should I commit to this way of working? But once you've done it, it's almost like your brain goes, oh, okay, we've got that, and that channel stays there. That supply of energy can be taken from there. But if there's carbs coming in, we'll use them. So now I won't feel bad about having pancakes with the kids at the weekend. I'll just sort of tie it into what I'm doing, and know that I probably won't have anything else to eat during the day until the evening, and I'll be doing some kind of activity, either a run or going paddleboarding or something. And I know that I'll be able to sort of use those carbs. My body will go, oh, it won't go, oh, it's poison, I can't have this. It will just go, okay, carbs, use them, bang, done, and we're back into fat burning again. Because I've heard you mention this before, that when you studied keto adapted people, that even when you did feed them carbs, their bodies were still burning a really high rate of fat. Do you think that's something that's common to all keto adapted athletes then?
Yeah, I suspect so. Once you're at least what I would describe as like chronically keto adapted, so you've been keto for at least, say, 6 months, I think is where most people would say, okay, there's not going to be any arguments here, like you're keto adapted. What we find, at least in the lab, because I've had some people be a little bit concerned, I guess, of coming into the lab, because they don't want to take carbohydrate at all. They're kind of afraid of carbs. And so just out of interest, I started testing blood ketones after people finished in my lab. So after every single trial they came in with, so whether they've had the placebo or the carbohydrate, just test their ketones at the end. And I found that they were showing ketones each time. So regardless of whether they took carbohydrate or placebo, and that's, at the highest carbohydrate phase of the study is about, it's a 2-day preload plus straight before exercise on the day. So that's basically 3 days of carbohydrate to a point, and it's not loads of carbohydrate. It's loads in the context of someone keto adapted, about 150 grams a day, plus then just a carbohydrate drink before. And even after that, they're straight back into ketosis afterwards. I think that kind of shows, as a keto adapted individual, how flexible you can be. I think that's an important point. I think there are kind of two things as you were talking. I was like, right, these are both quite important to mention. And the first one is that people need to be educated about keto flu before they start a keto diet, because otherwise, if you're any kind of athlete and you do something to try and help your performance and you feel as bad as people sometimes can do, you're not going to do the diet. You're going to stop, and rightly so. I think one of the hallmarks of long-term success is just people understanding that, especially for the first 2-3 weeks, they might not feel very good, and just accepting that as kind of part of it. And secondly, just that, exactly like you mentioned, that kind of flexibility or just openness to, okay, like I'm not going to panic if life happens and I have pancakes with the kids. Like you don't want to prevent yourself having those kind of moments in your life that are quite important or whatever. It's about like using your diet kind of to your advantage, and the fact that, okay, you can, like, especially as an endurance athlete, you can run and burn off as much carbohydrate as you want to, basically, right? So if you're taking it in, you can get rid of it. Like the body's quite good at that. So I think from when I've spoken to long-term adherents, none of them, they all cheat sometimes. And when I say cheat, I think cheat's the wrong word. They just live your life, and carbohydrates will come in every now and then, and you work around that to maintain your fat adaptation. And I don't see a way for the vast majority of people to stay extremely low carb all the time and not ever change that. I think that's quite important, because I think people's perception of keto is, oh, what do you do at your kid's birthday? What do you do at blah, 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 all these kind of all these big events. I think that's the point, is that you don't do keto. Or maybe you do. If you go to a restaurant, sometimes there is a keto option. You can just, you can get the chicken Caesar salad if you're out for a lunch, and no one's going to bat an eyelid if you want to. But also you can choose like a fairly low carb but not keto option, or just a regular meal. If you're going to go out for a long run the next day, then if you're keto adapted, you're going to be in ketosis after that run. When I first started researching it, I was kind of playing around myself, and I was seeing just how much I could abuse carbohydrate while still maintaining ketosis, which is definitely not a health recommendation. But I remember at its absolute worst point, I remember having, so when I was rowing, obviously it's quite a glycolytic sport. So I was like, right, how much carbohydrate can I eat and then still try and be in ketosis the next day? And so I planned, I remember it was a Sunday, because we used to have our like long rowing sessions on a Sunday. And so we had a hard rowing session in the morning. It was like sort of 7 till 12, so quite long and fairly hard work. And I got back, fasted the day, had a pizza, big takeaway pizza. And these are, we've got a place here that does a 20-inch pizza, right? These are huge. They are impressively sized pizzas. Had it, felt absolutely dreadful after, obviously. But, all for science. Tested my ketones the next morning. I was at 1.1, which was higher than I was the morning before. So it just shows, and obviously, firstly, probably not very good for me, right? But secondly, I've planned my whole day around it. I've not had like a whole day of loads of carbohydrate. So I've glycogen depleted and I've fasted. But it just shows just how, as long as you focus on like the lifestyle aspect, that you can every now and then, if you want, go for a meal, and it's not the end of the world. I remember I've seen people before talk about, I think it might have been on Twitter, to be honest. Nothing good ever happens on Twitter, but people talking about like keto adapted athletes, and I think Zach Better came up in conversation. I saw a comment saying, he's not keto, have you seen what he eats before a race? And I think that's exactly the perception that needs to change, because even keto doesn't mean you never ever touch a carbohydrate. I think that's quite important for people to know, because a lot of, especially if someone maybe is curious to try it, but it's a bit like, oh, but I kind of, this is my favorite restaurant and I want to still go there, etc. It's like, you can still do that. It's just about fitting it in with your lifestyle, and not having carbohydrate at every meal and not making it like a every day or every other day thing, etc.
That's the kind of thing that I struggled with when I first started looking at different options. And you see on Instagram, you see the pages, like the keto pages, and every day they're putting on like sweet treats that have been made in a keto way. And I was like, I need to try this. So I'm going to make pancakes with almond flour and all this. And I remember them and just being like really disappointed, and just thinking, I would rather just have the real deal and accept that if it does kick me out to ketosis, which it sounds like it probably doesn't anyway, or even if it does, it's only momentarily, and then your body goes back into burning that kind of thing afterwards. And I was sort of almost down on myself to begin with, thinking I don't think I can stick to keto, because I can't go with all these different options. It's almost like how, no offense to like vegans and vegetarians, but how they will make like a vegan burger or vegan bacon. Almost, to me, it feels like I would rather have the real thing and just accept the consequences of it and just have it. Probably not a good illustration to use, but as far as dividing people in nutrition. But but I think there must be a bit of a, do you see there's got to be a divide between people who are keto and purely keto, and then at first I put myself into keto brackets, and then eventually I'd stopped referring to myself as being keto and it's just being low carb, because I accepted that I was going to take on carbs, even if they were just incidental ones. I wouldn't be 100% regimented and be strictly keto. I would allow these carbs when I wanted them and when I felt like I needed them sometimes, just like, a weekend you just think, well, I just fancy not a blowout, but like you were saying, if you plan it, then there's no reason why you can't sort of plan it into your schedule, into your eating routine, where you've perhaps fasted for X amount of time, and then you have something that you wouldn't normally eat. And it's like your body has gone, okay, we don't normally eat this, but we'll burn it up and we'll use it, and then we're back into the normal state that we're in. Do you think that we need to sort of divide ourselves? Well, this is wrong, because we shouldn't divide ourselves, should we? It's like subdividing a subculture already, isn't it? So I don't know. If somebody said to me, my wife would say, oh yes, he does keto, he's a keto adapted runner, but I wouldn't say that about myself. I would say that I'm just low carb. And I'm trying to think of a question to come out of this, but I'm just
No, I know what you mean. I think this is where I think it becomes important to differentiate between why someone's doing what they're doing. Yeah. Because if your goal is ketosis, then then that pancake's a no-go forever. But like, if you're an ultra runner on a low carb diet, you're not doing it to be in ketosis all the time. You're doing it to, well, people do it for a lot of reasons, but if it's specific to endurance, it tends to be make yourself the best fat burner you can be. And being out of ketosis for 3 hours after you've had a pancake isn't going to make a jot of difference to that. I think, with labels, to be honest, I find almost any dietary label unhelpful. And I'm part of the problem here, because to define my own research, we have to use these terms, and they are defined in research. You have keto defined about 100 different ways, to be honest. It's useless. Then you have low carb defined as under 130 grams a day. But at the same time, because what is keto? What does keto mean? Is such like it depends why you're doing it. Like someone wanting to lose weight is probably going to cheat on their diet, or I say cheat, add carbohydrate back into the diet, probably less so. And that's probably for the best. I only know the community of endurance-based athletes, and from my experience, your dietary habits, like you mentioned, where you're not going to worry if you have carbohydrate here and there, is typical of just about everyone else, and you get the odd exception, of course. But I think because of the nature of what you do, you can afford to be that bit more flexible. Now, in my research, we'll call that keto adapted, because you are keto adapted, but at the same time, keto adapted to you, what you eat to become keto adapted is very different to what someone that's on a weight loss journey is going to eat to become keto adapted. So there are definitely differences there. I think the biggest difference is the why, I suppose, of why is someone doing it. So what is their goal? So I think that's probably, and then does it end up in two groups of, like, there's kind of less strict and the more strict? Maybe. I mean, I don't know, because I've done sort of interview-based research looking at keto adapted athletes or endurance, like runners, cyclists, etc. I know that population quite well. I've not done the same with people that are looking to lose fat. I would guess most people that are on the diet for most reasons. I think very few people are able to stick to it every day and never do anything different, because life happens. And so you'll definitely get degrees of, some people will have some carbohydrate over the weekend, and some people will maybe have carbohydrate once every 3-4 months, and maybe some people haven't had it for years. But I think the majority will fall into a camp of, when life happens, carbohydrates are inevitably going to be higher. And it's you kind of play a damage limitation game. And I guess there's always going to be levels of strictness. And I think the biggest difference there is probably going to be the kind of why is someone doing it. And you guys are lucky as ultra runners and ultra endurance athletes, because you can get away with more. I mean, the amount of calories you can burn in a day as an ultra runner is insane.
Yeah, it's almost you can have your cake and eat it.
Yeah, I mean,
that applies.
when running ultra endurance events, you can't avoid being in ketosis. I mean, you got data on, I always forget exactly how far they were going, but there's this multi-day endurance event, a 5-day event, and they tracked people's carbohydrate intake and their ketones at the end of the day. And these are non-adapted athletes. They're completely standard, like consuming, I think the average was 9 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate per day. So quite a lot. That's a good amount. They're eating a load of carbohydrate, and they're all in ketosis at the end of every day, maybe the end of days 3, 4, and 5. They're in ketosis a lot of the time as non-keto adapted athletes, just because of the exercise they're doing. And obviously that doesn't mean that as a runner you are by nature keto adapted, because you're not, because people can't run all day every day all the time. But it kind of shows that you can play with carbohydrate and still be keto adapted. And especially when you're running and when your energy expenditure is so high, it's impossible to not burn carbohydrate. So if you've eaten more, it's so easy to get rid of it when you're running. When you go out for a 4-hour run at the weekend, but that's boom, it's gone.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it is for us ultra endurance runners. We do have the best of both worlds.
Completely.
Yeah. As far as like your research now, who are you? Because I know I got in touch with you through Zach Bitter, and you looking for people to interview and research in this area. What are you after at the minute? Are you after just keto adapted endurance athletes, or are you after a mix of people? What are you after for your research now?
Yeah, so it's definitely a mix, because we have, I mean, our 2 lab-based studies going on right now. One is with non-adapted individuals, which is where we're looking at ketone esters in particular, with carbohydrate as well. And the other lab study is keto-adapted individuals. I would say that keto-adapted individuals are much more few and far between. So they're the premium. They're the ones I chase down. And so we've got that, and we've got a few. So like our remote studies, all keto-adapted as well. So we've got most of the stuff we have going on is with keto-adapted individuals specifically, and then we've got this one lab study where it's non-adapted individuals and still related to ketones.
So as far as research goes, when I heard sports scientists and research scientists wanting to do studies, they always seem to, there's only so far you can go in a lab. As far as like an ideal situation for studying endurance athletes in the field, what would be your ideal scenario for studying athletes in the field to get this sort of, real world data?
Yeah, you're always in sports science kind of trying to weigh up the lab-based studies that you can make extremely well controlled versus these field-based studies, which in a lot of instances tell you a lot and tell you very different things, but in a very different way. And you always have a criticism of, there are a lot of things you can't control. So when we ran our case studies 4 or so years ago, we ran them, we ran an ultra marathon that we simulated around actually Richmond Park, just around here. And so it was a field-based study where we had our athlete run, I forget how many loops it is, about 5 loops of Richmond Park. So it's a 12-kilometer loop with a little bit extra on one of them. And so that was our way of looking at sort of in the field, a simulated ultra marathon race essentially. And on the loops, we were testing his lactates. We have like a portable metabolic cart. So he had one loop where he went around with a backpack with the metabolic cart on. So he's got like if you've seen, the sort of masks people wear in the lab, he was running around Richmond Park, one of those. And so I think he got some fairly strange looks doing that. So that was a really nice one for us in terms of just trying to get that balance between getting some really useful data, for example, with like our portable metabolic cart, but also try and make it ecologically valid, so making it sort of field-based. What I would love to do personally, I'd love to have an actual ultra endurance race where we're basically just testing everyone, right? Throwing metabolic carts on people and having that actual race element, because that's what it didn't have, because it was just one person running around a park. We're kind of trying to simulate an ultra marathon, but actually what you don't have is that actual competitive element. So if I was to dream up a study, it would be essentially like a simulated, an actual ultra marathon race. We have the route, we have people, we have checkpoints. At checkpoints, we can measure as much as we can measure. Take your blood, take everything you got. whack metabolic cards on, etc., and have all these different measures going down, and you kind of then add that race element into it. I think one interesting thing I'm interested in is actually just looking at what are ultra endurance athletes actually doing during a race. Like, how are they fueling, and like what are they consuming? So I'd love to just almost be a fly on the wall and have these races going on and just monitor food intake. Because you can compare, and comparing ultra endurance keto adapted to non-keto adapted, I can guess that keto adapted people are probably taking on less carbohydrate, but actually non-keto adapted athletes never taking as much carbohydrate as they're told to, because it's quite hard to. Like, often some people might not have much of an appetite, some people might struggle to stomach that much carbohydrate. So part of me is like, I wonder if actually being keto adapted just means that you get the same amount of carbs, but you don't need any more. Whereas non-keto adapted, a lot of, because again, some non-keto adapted people will be quite good at burning fat, but a subpopulation of people that are, standard, not exceptional fat burners on a normal diet, which is probably most of them, basically always playing a game of catch up with their body where they're never gaining quite enough carbohydrate. So I wonder then if, would we see actually that there's no difference actually in carbohydrate intake over a race? It's just that we've got one group that are really good at burning fat and are just using the carbohydrate they need, and one group that are kind of playing catch up all the way along.
Yeah, that would be an interesting study to be able to perform, wouldn't it? Yeah, I'm sure the running community would get behind you, and if you wanted to organise something like that, I'm sure there'd be plenty. There's plenty of keto runners out there, and some of them that don't shout about it, and others are a bit more vocal as you get social media. But if people want to get in touch with you and be part of these studies, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
In terms of the studies, it's probably my email is the best way. So I have an email. My university professional email is m.carpenter@kingston.ac.uk. Otherwise, I'm on Twitter. I'm not especially active on Twitter because I refuse to engage in any arguments. But I'm there at Matt Carpenter 14. I retweet interesting things, which is about all I do.
Brilliant. Yeah, Matt, I just want to thank you for sharing this knowledge with us. That I've definitely learned plenty from you, and I'm really curious to find out the results of these studies that you're doing, because I think that the future's bright for fat burners, I think, and the more we can get in, not into the mainstream, but more be accepted as just it's just normal for us to do, then all the better. And I know that the work that you're doing hopefully will lead in that direction. So I'm grateful for all the information that you shared. I appreciate your time coming on, talking to us.
No worries. It's always a good conversation, and I enjoyed it. And yeah, I think you're right. I think it's an exciting time, I think, in terms of research around fat metabolism in general. And there's a lot coming out, not just from our lab. I see new stuff coming out all the time that really gets me excited, at least. So yeah, I'm keeping a close eye on it.
Brilliant. We'll keep in touch and watch this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot for having me on.
Cheers. Thanks. Bye.
Cheers.